Welcome, everyone, to the Only Healthcare podcast. Today we have a special guest with us who is going to share some of his impressions and insights from the Clinical Pathways Congress, as well as some insights from one of the key projects that has been going on now for a couple of years that was just published in the journal Clinical Pathways. So today with me is Gordon Kuntz. And Gordon, I'll let you introduce yourself to our audience.
Well, thanks, Randy. So I'm a consultant. I work mainly with pharma, helping them to understand how to navigate oncology care pathways and the broader ecosystem of oncology. I've been involved in the business side of oncology for about 20 years and pathways throughout most of that time. So I work with pharma today and help them to understand how all that works.
Great. In addition, you and I are both on the editorial board for the Journal of Clinical Pathways. And what we'll first kind of talk a little bit about is the Clinical Pathways Congress, as well as the Cancer Care Business Exchange, which happened recently in Boston. And I didn't realize myself, it was the 20th anniversary of that Congress. You served as the moderator. So what were some of your impressions and thoughts?
So actually, it was the 9th anniversary of the Congress. Pathways have been around for 20 years. So coincidental with my start in oncology care on the business side, Pathways were sort of first launched in 2005 by U.S. Oncology. The journal came along 10 years later. And so it was the 10th anniversary of the journal and then the 9th Clinical Pathways Congress. The Cancer Center Business Exchange, of course, joined the Congress a couple years ago. And I've had the honor of moderating since 2019. So near and dear to my heart. And so my, impressions about this year's Congress, we work at it throughout the year, trying to get good guests and cohesive framework and have it all make sense for the few hundred people who show up. And I think we did better this year than we have in the past. I've heard that comment a number of times. And I think the reason is, when I first started going to the Congress was 2017, and it was very clinically oriented. It was focused on how to develop pathways. And then, the focus has turned more towards a business perspective in the last few years and sort of how pathways are used. And we've, up until this point, we've been talking about artificial intelligence in a very theoretical way. Probably for 2 or 3 years, it's coming, here's this thing that we all need to understand, but no real definition to it. And this year, from the keynote speaker who I thought did a great overview of how AI is evolving, we're at the very beginning of what that transformation will look like. Many of us who lived through sort of the personal computer, revolution in the 80s, you at first you weren't really sure how it was all going to work, and now of course everything is internet and the computers are ubiquitous and it's impacted our daily lives. I think AI is heading the same direction, though how it will evolve in healthcare remains a great question, just because of some of the challenges that exist in healthcare, right? Of getting people to talk and computer systems to talk to one another. So anyway, great keynote speech about that. A couple of great sessions talking about how AI is actually being used in the day-to-day lives of oncology practices. From Pharma Day, which is a sponsored day that occurs before the Congress, we had a question for the panelists who are all pathway developers. We asked them how they are using AI, and the answer is not a lot. They're interested in how it can be used to assess patient records for possible alignment to clinical trials. I think that holds a lot of promise. But in terms of actually using AI to develop pathways, I don't know that we're going to see that anytime soon, and maybe maybe never. I know there's a couple of initiatives that have, kind of referenced that, but the collegial back and forth that occurs within those disease committees, it turns out, is actually pretty important in and of itself.
So there were definitely some very interesting discussions around AI, as you pointed out, Gordon. at this Congress. But I'm curious, was there anything outside of oncology, or does it remain pretty much focused on oncology
For the Congress?
at the Congress?
Yeah. The title is broader than that. We've had some presentations in past years, but there's some unique attributes of oncology. The rapid pace of change, the existence of groups like ASCO and NCCN that are standard setting when it comes to guidelines, as well as the complexity of the disease. When I first started in oncology, we used to talk about the fact that it was 300 different diseases, not one. Elsevier Clinical Path now has over 2,500 different indications supported through their pathway software. So it's incredibly complex disease, incredibly expensive disease, rapidly changing, but with the existence of standard setting bodies. So that combination of attributes, and the fact that it's mainly drug dependent, that combination of attributes really just doesn't exist in a lot of other specialties. You have lots of best practices and standards of care, but they're less complex, less rapidly evolving than you might find in oncology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Oncology's always been kind of a leader of sorts in a lot of different aspects of change in healthcare, use of pathways, and so forth.
Absolutely.
It might be helpful for our audience to give us a little bit of a description, since you've been involved for so long, about what pathways are and how oncology kind of kicked this off years ago.
So oncology clinical pathways are and I'm going to put them together. Some people do separate the pathway from the decision support system, but in many ways they belong together. It's a set of evidence-based guidance. Avoid the use of the word guidelines. Guidelines are a broader set of guidance for physicians, and I always describe it as guidelines. NCCN guidelines, for example, tell oncologists what they could do. Pathways tell them what they should do. So it's evidence-based, disease presentation specific or indication specific, that really prioritizes efficacy first, then safety, and as a tiebreaker, third is cost. That's been the mandate, from the very beginning in oncology when these were first developed, as I said, 20 years ago. And it's still the case today. Nothing really has changed about that. There's been some minor refinements around the edges. And the goal is really to have a set of these, specific recommendations. They are recommendations. They're not mandates. A set of recommendations for oncologists to follow for about 80% of patients. 20% of the time, there's something about the patient, some characteristic of the patient, comorbidity, prior therapy, whatever it may be, that would lead the clinician to think that that's probably not the right choice for them, not the best recommendation for them. And so that's considered off pathways, but that's actually expected in the model, is that 20% of the time that's going to occur.
Okay. Yeah, that was very helpful. When we think about who's at this Congress that was again held in Boston for the last several years that I know of,
Yeah.
Who would kind of describe who attends, what brings them to the meeting, and maybe a little bit about the kind of questions that you hear walking around.
So it's, I find it an interesting group. It's usually about 250 to 350 attendees. And they're a real mix. And honestly, this has been a challenge from an agenda setting perspective. You got a lot of pharma people who come. We appreciate their support. Many of them are sponsors. You have others who simply attend. You have pathway developers. So this year we had representatives from, honestly, all the major pathways and a lot of the minor pathways. We had Elsevier, Value Pathways, Evolent, UHC, Kaiser, Aon. Really, all the pathway developers were represented, with a couple of exceptions. That's who the pharma people are there to see primarily. But you also have a few clinicians, because there are some clinically oriented sessions. They can get their CE credits over lunch. You also have business people from the cancer centers that are there for the business content. So we really end up with a nice mixed bag, honestly, of people interacting at various levels, from those responsible for content, perhaps at one of the pathway developers, to the leader of that organization, to folks that we know were there as administrators, of cancer centers that are leading the way. I find it really an interesting set of presentations, because generally it's people who are talking about what they're doing that is sort of leading edge. Barry Russo has been there. I don't think he spoke this year, but he's been there the last couple of years. He's spoken about what their organization, the center in Fort Worth, which is a very progressive oncology practice, and I think represents the leading edge of where oncology is going from an operational standpoint. He's talked about that. You've got a number of organizations, as we talked about, discussing how they're using AI and that sort of thing. And then you have pathway developers talking about what's new in their worlds as well. So it's an interesting mix, but generally pharma, some business people on the oncology side, and then the pathway developers who may be within an organization, within a provider organization, One Oncology, et cetera, or they may be just a third-party developer like Elsevier.
Mm-hmm. So what is the direction when we look towards 2026 for the Congress? What kinds of changes were discussed, or areas of interest that came up from the 2025 program?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that we've settled on an agenda quite yet, but
I know that, but we want an early heads up.
Yeah, I think we're gonna, I think in some ways it's more of the same. The business content has continued to evolve. We went from 3 days to 2 days this year. The challenge always is when you run a meeting, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, like it used to be. Sunday's tough. I was moderating a couple of years ago, and I counted 8 people in the audience who weren't either presenting or about to present on Sunday afternoon. And the problem is those people presenting on Sunday afternoon put just as much into their presentation as the one who comes after the keynote. So I think shortening it a little bit helped to sort of concentrate the effort. My guess is we'll see more conversations about AI. My hope is always that we end up having more conversations about kind of what's actually happening, as opposed to, it's always interesting to talk about what's going to happen in a year or two. I just saw a newsletter as I was getting ready to get on the call today with you that talked about most major payers will increase membership over the next 10 years. I'm like, that's completely unhelpful. I would expect that they would grow over 10 years or they'll be out of business. So yeah, that's not really helpful. So, the long-term predictions are always interesting. I guess that's sort of what a keynote's all about, is getting you to think more broadly about what the future can hold. But in terms of the rest of the sessions, I always look for those things that are more practical. What is a thing that, if we had an administrator there and somebody's talking about what they're actually doing in their practice, whether it's in AI or using pathways or whatever, that's what I think is really most valuable. And one quick note, it's the Pathways Congress. So yes, pathways are a through line and pathways are an important part of it. But just like the journal, it's not limited exclusively to topics that are directly tied to pathways. There's an opportunity to talk about how these various initiatives are playing out within an organization, within a practice that maybe aren't directly tied to pathways, but they're certainly a pathways user. And I think there's sufficient interest that if anybody has success stories they want to talk about, that's probably a good place to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know with the journal, the different columns that come out throughout the year in the editorial calendar that include some of the business trends, as you mentioned, and also the employer perspective as
Absolutely.
it relates to what's the implications from clinical pathways.
Right.
So one of the other areas, and kind of shifting gears, is looking at a major effort that's been underway for the last couple of years looking at predictable cost of care model for treatment decisions, which is something that you've co-chaired along with Carol Tremonti.
Right.
And there was a session at the Congress to get feedback, I guess, from the publication, as well as to get a broader feel from the marketplace as to where people are at in terms of treatment decisions and the cost of care. So can you kind of comment in general about how this came about and the publication that just came out with the Congress on this care model initiative?
So this is a project that had been sort of percolating in my head for a number of years, based on various conversations. Back in 2020, I was involved with an initiative through HMP that was a sort of looking at the future of pathways, and we had a multi-stakeholder group, 3 co-chairs, Robin Zahn, Winston Wong, and myself, and met for 2 years with a fairly broad audience of stakeholders and talking about what the future of pathways might hold. One of the things that came up was the notion that pathways have always looked, when we talked about that cost consideration, the third of the 3, efficacy, safety, and then cost, has always only looked at the cost of the therapeutic drug, not the administration, not the side effects, not the other drugs that are administered, anything like that. Only the cost of the therapy itself at ASP. So a very limited view of cost. Now, drugs are a very significant part of the total cost of care, but are far from everything. Used to be, back when I first started thinking about this in 2020, they were probably on average about 30% of the cost. Today, it might be, closer to 50%, but that means there's another 50% that's everything else, right? Right. So we started talking about this at that point, and basically everybody I talked to said it's just too complicated. You can't figure it out. It's not possible. You can't, and in many ways they're right? You can't figure out what total cost of care in a payer's view of total cost of care, which is every healthcare dollar spent on behalf of the particular patient or a set of patients in a population. You can't know that until after the fact. Right? You can't know it in its totality. People have heart attacks, people have auto accidents, there's all sorts of things that happen to people who may also have cancer, right? And so you can't know what that totality is until you are retrospectively looking at that. But there's a number of cost categories that are highly predictable, that we can know what they are and we can predict what they would be for any given therapy. And that's where this notion of predictable cost of care as opposed to total cost of care was born. Cost of drugs, we know about that. We tag in on ASP with that. Cost of administration can be calculated. The cost of any workup that needs to be done can be calculated. The cost of side effect management, in fact, can be calculated. If we look at the package insert, which has the clinical trial data, which tells you how often within the trial population patients had dehydration or neutropenia or whatever their side effect might have been. There's a percentage of patients who had grade 3 or grade 4 dehydration, for example. And so we can know how many there are, right? We can know what that percentage application should be, and we can calculate what the cost is. So starting last year, we gathered a group of pathway developers. That was the first intended audience. We gathered a group of pathway developers, had broad representation of pathway developers on that, a couple of pharma sponsors, and started discussing this notion that we would come up with this predictable cost of care. And we narrowed some things down. We decided to set some things aside. We decided to, continue on with others. Some parameters around this. There has to be a high degree of trust that this information is accurate, and that we know the source of it. So we're looking to rely heavily on the clinical trial and the package insert. Real world data would be super helpful. When a drug is first released, we don't really have that yet. So again, apples to apples, we're going to rely on the clinical trial and the package insert. We're going to use publicly available costing data, like Medicare is really the trigger. We know that that's not what everybody gets paid for every particular situation, but most contracts can scale from that. If you wanted to scale the model to a commercial contract. I don't want to know what your commercial contract rates are because that gets dodgy. But you could say we're going to take Medicare and add 8%, and that maybe emulates your cost profile for commercial. So we came up with these cost categories. Again, what workup is needed, what pre-meds are needed, the cost of drugs and administration, any monitoring, testing, side effect management for all the noted side effects from the clinical trial. And the focus is around what I would sort of refer to as the incremental cost for a therapy. So we decided not to include any recommended testing like NGS testing for lung cancer. That's recommended across the board. It's not specific to a given therapy. It's recommended for all non-small cell lung cancer patients. So we set that aside. There's other pieces we decided to include, and that was and the first year was really about defining those parameters, like what was included, what was excluded. We used non-small cell lung cancer as the model, but the intent is to have a model eventually that would be applicable really to all different kinds of therapies, solid tumor, heme, whatever, immunotherapy, chemotherapy. Fundamentally, the same basic categories exist, right? There's workup and prep. There's administration of the therapy. There's probably some sort of adverse event side effect management. There's monitoring, etc. So we're working on the model right now. That's what phase 2 is all about, is actually developing this model and making sure we have the right inputs for it. That process is ongoing. The conversation in Boston at the meeting was really about sharing where we're at with the model and then asking for help, because we need a couple of things right now. One is we need some of these inputs. The side effect management part, we know how to do, but it's complicated. And we want to make sure we understand, what is a sort of a mini module, if you will, for that grade 3 and 4. And we've decided to only look at costing for grade 3 and 4, by the way. But that grade 3 and 4 dehydration, what are the cost elements needed to treat that particular side effect? And so we need to know at a more granular level than just a simple total number. We need to know what are the services, what are the units, and then we apply the unit cost. So we're looking for that. And then also, once we have the model built, which we expect to have certainly by the end of the year, we're looking for drug companies to help us test this. And what that means is they would take an existing drug, they would go to their package insert, they would apply all the components that are needed to fill out the model. What's the dosing schedule look like? What are the number of units of their particular therapy? We'll have the ASP cost of that. What are all the side effects? What's the incidence of those? Grade 3 and 4, we add those in, add any of the other cost components to calculate this overall model. And that, so having done that, we can test this, we can see how it works, we can see if there's any problems, if we miss anything, or whatever might occur. Mm-hmm. Once that's done, the whole point of this is that it becomes another pieces of data, in fact, for the disease committees to consider. Efficacy is still number 1. Safety is still number 2. None of that changes. But now we have a more complete picture of what costs would look like. We expect that, in fact, we will see certain components of this being focused in on by certain disease committees more or less. So instead of just a number at the end, the model would include subtotals for each of those categories I mentioned. So that if the disease committee wants to understand, what the cost of the adverse events is, they can focus on that, or the cost of delivery, drug and delivery. What's been interesting is, as we've kind of gone through the last 2 years, we discovered a whole other set of use cases. Leyland Wilfong is on the committee. He's with Time Care now. And so as a value-based care intermediary, they're interested in how this could be used. They've already set their rates with their customers, which are health plans. A new drug enters the market. What's this going to do to our model? How can we think about this? And it gives them, again, some additional data points to go and do some more investigation. Oncology practices are entering value-based care models, whether government-sponsored or private. Payers we see as another way. Employers is certainly another group as well. So there's quite a number of stakeholders with this as we go forward, but they're all looking for the same basic information, which is help me understand more about the cost than just the cost of the drug, because we know that's not everything. And for this particular therapy, what can we expect as an incremental cost model?
Okay. So you covered a lot of ground, but that was perfect to help understand. So you refer to disease committees. Is that different than P&T committees or other established committees that we're probably more familiar with?
Yes. So disease committees within pathway development organizations, whether it's One Oncology and it's sort of a practice initiated, or whether it's Elsevier Clinical Path and they're more of a vendor, kind of deal. Those disease committees are specialists in a particular disease, lung cancer, breast cancer, whatever it may be, and they evaluate new therapies, new information, new clinical trials against the existing standard of care to decide which one should be the recommended standard of care going forward. In organizations like McKesson, the P&T committee, actually the pathways task forces, what they refer to, the decision-making body around pathways, is a subcommittee of their P&T committee. So those two are really related. And in most cases, in most practices that are developing pathways, those two organizations are related.
Yeah, I always think about pathways as a component of inputs that are being considered by some decision-making organization, whether it's a P&T committee or in a like an employer-sponsored health plan. It's probably in the overall strategic goal for the organization, and then ultimately what all the details look like down the road. But having that, I kind of look at it as you're trying to get a handle on what's this aggregate cost going to look like that ultimately needs to be underwritten for insurance.
That's right.
Whether it's government or private, commercial. And right now, nobody really knows. It's a total guessing game.
Yeah. I don't think people are ignorant of the fact that the other costs exist, and they might make, reasonable guesses, but until you sort of detail it out, it's hard to know exactly. And really, you can't fix what you can't measure. So measuring it may actually create opportunities for focus around different initiatives in the future.
So I'm glad you brought up measuring too, because having metrics is always important. Are you using established measures or metrics, or are you also determining some that really haven't been used before that should have been used?
So we're using, very traditional metrics when it comes to the actual cost model. CPT codes, procedure codes, and then the unit cost or the number of units that are required, and the unit costing, as I mentioned, would be derived from Medicare fee schedules. One of the other things that we were called on after the first year to include is some reflection of patient cost. And this is very complicated because if we actually tried to get at what's the cost of a patient undergoing cancer therapy, as you know, you've got, deductibles, out of pockets. It's very complicated. Is it medical? Is it part B or part D benefits? All those things. Yeah, just in the pharmacy, and all that makes it just, honestly, we can't know for an individual what that cost is going to be, much less in aggregate. So what we've decided to do is really focus on what the again, incremental cost to the patient from a touch point standpoint. There's the whole, part that we talked about with the dollar cost, but how many touch points, because that influences the patient's whole experience. So what we're really going to be asking pharma to do is to document essentially every time a patient would have to interact with the healthcare system. Do you need labs? That's one. Do you need other scans? That's another one. Do you need a drug administered? That's a third one. Now, from a scheduling standpoint, yes, I would expect practices to do as many of those in one at one visit that they could. But again, from a model standpoint, we're going to identify how many touch points occur. If they can be coordinated, that's the goal. But frankly, we need to assume they aren't being coordinated because we don't know how that would exactly work for any individual in any particular circumstance. So that's sort of the thing that we're focusing on right now, and that's a bit of a non-traditional measure to sort of focus on these touch points with the healthcare system. We've added Alan Balch, who's a great advocate for cancer patients. We've added him to the committee this year as well. So we're continuing to work on that in parallel with the financial model that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, there's certainly been a lot of activity, more than I had realized, around this effort. And I look forward to seeing and hearing more, maybe even perhaps being part of the committee in some way or support some of these efforts, because it's definitely needed in the marketplace.
Well,
patients are looking for this certainty. I call it certainty as well as predictability, which the employer or plan sponsors are also looking for. So it's a good starting point that's sorely needed.
Well, and one of the things we'll be tackling towards the end of the year and into next year, I think, is the ongoing governance. This is not a once and done. This year ends, we're done. I don't have to think about this again. Because essentially, in future years, we'll want to update the underlying fee schedules. When do we decide to move to 2026 fees instead of 2024 fees? There will be new side effects. Cytokine release syndrome wasn't a side effect to be concerned about until bispecifics came along and CAR T. And then all of a sudden, because we're working in the immunotherapy realm, those sorts of things are occurring, and you have a lot more issues with that. Wasn't a traditional chemotherapy side effect, right? There will be other side effects. I don't know what they're going to be, but they will show up as the technology of cancer therapies evolves, and the model will need to adapt to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate your sharing some of the history as well as the learnings coming out of the Congress, as well as the work that's been underway around this predictable care model, which looks very promising as well.
It's been exciting. It was nice when I reached out to the pathway developers a year and a half ago, and we started talking about this, and they were all, very ready to get started. Several of them actually had already had sort of one-off initiatives, and what we're trying to do with this is to create an industry-wide solution, because that's one of the problems. When different pharma companies submit data to all these pathway developers, and they submit it in different formats and with different assumptions and different sources of data, it's impossible for them to really reconcile those. So we're trying to create this framework that's easy for pathway developers to consume, easy for pharma to produce, that actually has benefit to a number of stakeholders.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us on this podcast and participating in the work that we're trying to do in informing and educating everyone in healthcare, including the patients and the providers that are touched by a lot of what you're talking about through these pathways. And I want to thank the audience for listening in to this edition and episode of the Only Healthcare podcast. It's available on all platforms. We continue to expand and grow our audience reach. We appreciate your following the podcast and sharing with your friends and colleagues. Till next time, have a great time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Only Healthcare podcast. We hope you found today's episode insightful and informative. Remember, our mission is to provide actionable and inspirational insights on how we can improve healthcare cost, care, and accessibility for all. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and share with your friends and family. For more resources and updates, visit us at onlyhealthcarepodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes. Until next time, stay informed, and together, let's navigate the journey to better healthcare.